Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself.
I still remember the exact moment my world shifted, though at the time I didn't know it would. I had been rummaging through the back of my closet for a shirt I thought was mine when I heard the soft creak of my mother's footsteps behind me. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. Her voice was calm but carried a gravity that made my chest tighten. "We need to talk." The words felt ordinary, but in that small kitchen, with the fading afternoon light slanting across the counter, they hung like a verdict. It started with a simple question. Had I been experimenting with clothes I wasn't supposed to touch? I froze, words sticking to the back of my throat. I wanted to deny it, to make it all seem silly, but her gaze wasn't one that could be fooled easily. She was patient, but I could see the understanding beneath it, the recognition of something I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. In that moment, I realized I had been carrying a secret not because it was shameful, but because I didn't yet understand it. Her proposal, or command, as it felt to my stubborn, adolescent self, was unexpected. She said that for a period of time, I would live in a way that forced me to confront this part of myself. I would dress as a girl, fully and completely, under her guidance. It wasn't framed as punishment or reward, but as a form of accountability, an experiment in empathy and self-exploration. I wanted to argue, to resist, but every objection dissolved under the weight of her calm insistence. The strange thing was that even as panic bubbled in my chest, there was a flicker of curiosity I hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. The first day was the hardest. Sitting on my bed, pulling on unfamiliar fabrics, I felt like an imposter in my own skin. Every movement was self-conscious, every reflection in the mirror a silent critique. But somewhere beneath the anxiety, beneath the awkwardness and the fear of judgment, I began to notice subtle shifts in myself. How I carried my weight, how my voice unconsciously softened, how my thoughts wandered into corners I had previously ignored. Each gesture, each forced habit, began to feel like a small lesson in understanding another facet of humanity, my own included. By evening, I was exhausted but reflective. My mother watched quietly as I prepared for bed, her presence a mixture of scrutiny and support. She didn't insist I speak, but her eyes invited honesty. I realized I wasn't just trying on clothing. I was trying on identity, testing boundaries I had never approached with such deliberate attention. And though I had no idea where this path would lead, I felt the first hint of clarity, that growth, uncomfortable and disorienting though it might be, was worth enduring. The next morning arrived with an uneasy quiet. I woke before the sun, the room half lit by the pale, gray light seeping through the blinds. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, tracing the familiar grooves and cracks, trying to anchor myself in something I recognized. But my body felt foreign, heavier in some ways, softer in others, and the memory of yesterday's clothing experiment clung to my skin like a whisper I couldn't shake. I realized that my mother's suggestion was not just about clothes. It was a mirror she was holding up to my psyche, demanding I confront truths I had been running from. Breakfast was subdued. My mother moved with her usual efficiency, but there was a quiet tension in the air, a sense that something had shifted irrevocably. She asked about my plans for the day, but even small talk felt loaded. I noticed how my own voice sounded different, how the words I spoke seemed to carry a weight they never had before, as if acknowledging this side of myself required a certain humility I hadn't exercised. I wasn't sure I wanted this, but I also knew I couldn't ignore it. The cognitive dissonance, the pull between denial and curiosity, twisted in my chest like a slow, persistent knot. By mid-morning, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again. I had chosen an outfit with her guidance, a simple skirt, a soft sweater, and shoes that didn't feel like shoes I would normally wear. Everything about the ensemble felt wrong, and right all at once. I ran my hands along the fabric, noticing the texture, the way it conformed differently to my body. There was a strange intimacy in the act, a connection to something I had always dismissed as frivolous or alien. And yet, as I looked at myself, I realized I was beginning to see potential, not the potential of becoming someone else, but the potential of becoming more fully myself. The day stretched onward with subtle, almost imperceptible lessons. I ventured outside briefly, and the world responded differently. The way people glanced at me, the way my own posture shifted without conscious effort, reminded me that identity is both personal and social. There was a vulnerability in being observed, a humbling recognition that the way we present ourselves communicates truths whether we intend it to or not. I felt exposed, but not humiliated. Each look, each passing judgment or assumption was a lesson in empathy. I began to understand how much of our daily behavior is shaped by expectation, by the unseen social contract that demands conformity, and how radical it can be to simply inhabit a different space in that contract, even for a short time. By evening, exhaustion hit me like a wave. My limbs ached in new ways, my thoughts raced, and yet there was a clarity I hadn't anticipated. I started journaling, at my mother's suggestion, but also as a lifeline. Words poured out, fears, questions, observations, reflections. I wrote about how strange it felt to inhabit a body that now seemed partially performative, partially authentic. I wrote about the tension between my desire for privacy and my growing awareness that hiding this part of myself had only created anxiety. I wrote about empathy, about how living, even temporarily, in the world as someone perceived differently could teach lessons that textbooks never could. Night came, quiet and patient. I lay in bed, feeling a new kind of fatigue, not just physical, but moral, emotional, and intellectual. My mother knocked softly, checking on me, and I realized that this was not punishment. It was a form of accountability, yes, but also guidance, a structured way to confront internal truths and social realities simultaneously. I had begun to see that transformation was not a switch, not a performance, but a sustained exercise in reflection, honesty, and courage. I fell asleep thinking about the day I had lived, not the clothes I had worn. I thought about the responsibility of understanding oneself fully, and the responsibility of treating others' differences with care. I felt a flicker of gratitude, not for the discomfort, but for the opportunity it represented. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring more questions, more challenges, more awkwardness. But it would also bring insight, and insight, I realized, was a currency worth paying attention to. The following days were a strange combination of routine and revelation. Each morning, I approached the mirror with a mix of dread and curiosity, learning to navigate this life my mother had asked me to inhabit. I quickly realized that the challenge was not just physical, it was social. The way I carried myself, the subtle movements I had never noticed before, the tone of my voice, the cadence of my speech, all these tiny signals conveyed messages I had never considered. At school, even mundane interactions carried weight. A glance from a friend, a passing remark, a misread gesture, it all felt magnified, charged with layers of meaning I was only beginning to understand. I began to notice the small, almost invisible ways that people adapt to each other, how society silently enforces conformity and punishes deviation. In one class, I realized mid-sentence that the way I was holding my notebook, the angle of my hands, the rhythm of my words, all subtly marked me as different. Some peers didn't seem to notice. Others glanced briefly, as if trying to reconcile something they couldn't quite name. I felt exposed in a way that was neither humiliating nor celebratory, just revealing. It struck me that every day, everyone navigates similar micro-adjustments, hiding aspects of themselves to meet expectations, fearing judgment or misunderstanding. I had thought my difference was monumental, but I began to see it as part of a broader human experience, the universal balancing act between authenticity and acceptance. At home, the dynamic with my mother deepened in unexpected ways. Our conversations became exercises in honesty, not accusation. She asked me what I had felt during the day, what moments had been uncomfortable, what had surprised me. I realized that through these questions, she was teaching me empathy, not just for others but for myself. I learned to articulate the feelings I had long ignored: vulnerability, uncertainty, fleeting pride, shame that wasn't deserved but self-imposed. These discussions were never lectures. They were invitations to introspection, ways to map my inner landscape, to confront fears and assumptions. One afternoon, a small but profound event shifted something inside me. I had gone to a cafe near the school, trying to navigate the world beyond home and classroom. Ordering coffee, I noticed the barista's expression, neutral, polite, but with a micro-curiosity that made me self-conscious. For a moment, I imagined judgment, criticism, or ridicule. And yet, nothing happened. The world kept moving, indifferent, and yet sensitive in ways I hadn't expected. I realized that much of my fear had been internal, projected outward from my own uncertainty. The external world was less threatening than my imagination. The real challenge was how I chose to inhabit myself within it. That realization, subtle as it was, felt like the first step toward self-possession. My friendships became a mirror for this transformation. Some friends were curious, some awkward, some hesitant. Conversations that once flowed easily now required nuance. I found myself explaining, not defending, not performing, but clarifying. I saw how fragile assumptions can be, how quickly social bonds can adjust when met with honesty rather than fear. And in return, I felt a quiet empowerment, a sense that being truthful, even in discomfort, could cultivate understanding. I was learning that identity is both personal and relational, a negotiation between who we are and how we are perceived. The moral lessons were not always straightforward. I stumbled, misjudged moments, acted impulsively, felt embarrassment, guilt, and regret. Each misstep was a mirror, reflecting aspects of myself I hadn't wanted to see. Sometimes I resented the process, frustrated by the slow pace of change, the discomfort of visibility. Other times, I was struck by the depth of insight it offered, about social expectation, about internalized shame, about the courage it takes to simply exist authentically. I began to understand that personal growth is rarely linear. It is messy, iterative, and often invisible to everyone but the one undergoing it. Evenings became a sacred time for reflection. I would sit with my journal, replay the day's interactions, interrogate my feelings, and trace the invisible lines between perception, expectation, and reality. I realized that the clothes I wore were not a costume but a catalyst, a tool that forced me to confront questions I had skirted for years. I began to see patterns in my reactions. When I felt shame, it often came from imagined judgment. When I felt pride, it came from small victories in honesty and self-possession. Each reflection was a step toward internal coherence, a recognition that identity is a living, evolving process, not a fixed label. By the end of the week, I noticed subtle changes in my sense of self. My posture had shifted, my voice had gained a steadiness I hadn't expected, my awareness of others' experiences had deepened. But more importantly, my understanding of responsibility had expanded. I realized that exploring myself so fully required me to act with integrity, to treat others with empathy, to recognize the ripple effect of my choices. Transformation, I began to see, was not merely about appearance or even self-recognition. It was about the ethical and emotional dimensions of existence, about learning to navigate the world with honesty, compassion, and self-awareness. I lay in bed that night, exhausted in a different way than before. The day had demanded emotional labor I hadn't anticipated, but it had also offered something invaluable: insight. I felt a cautious hope, a sense that while the path ahead would not be easy, it promised growth in ways I had never imagined. And for the first time, I felt a subtle alignment between my inner and outer worlds, a fragile, promising coherence that suggested I was beginning to inhabit myself fully, even if incompletely, even if imperfectly. Days turned into a rhythm I hadn't anticipated, a rhythm that both comforted and unsettled me. Waking, dressing, navigating school, conversations, fleeting glances, and then returning home to the quiet scrutiny and support of my mother. It was exhausting, but it was shaping something profound inside me. I began to notice how much of life is spent performing, not in an artificial sense, but simply existing within the bounds of expectation. Now, with my mother's experiment as a lens, every action, every posture, every syllable carried a new weight, a new significance. And with that weight came insight, and sometimes guilt. The hardest moments were the ones that caught me off guard, social interactions that revealed my own unexamined biases, my assumptions about what was normal, my fear of judgment. One afternoon, I walked with a friend I'd known for years. She didn't say anything about my appearance at first, but later, she asked a question that pierced me with clarity. "Do you feel different?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. I realized I didn't know how to answer. Different in what sense? Physically? Emotionally? Socially? I felt myself faltering because I had been so focused on performing a role, I hadn't paused to process what I was actually feeling. That silence, that hesitation, was a mirror reflecting the complexity of self-awareness, of honesty, of identity. Home, as always, was a paradoxical sanctuary and arena. My mother's guidance was firm but kind, her questions incisive but patient. One evening, she asked me why I resisted fully naming my feelings. I paused, uncertain. "Because I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing," I confessed. She nodded, as if she had expected this. "Saying the wrong thing isn't failure," she said. "It's part of learning. Growth happens in the missteps, not just the victories." Those words sank into me. I realized that transformation was not linear, and that the emotional labor, the introspection, the moral negotiation, was far heavier than the external gestures of clothing or voice or posture. School became a more complex terrain each day. I began noticing microaggressions that had previously passed unnoticed, subtle pressures that shaped behavior, and the invisible rules that govern gendered expectation. Sometimes I would catch myself tensing, imagining judgment where there might be none, imagining ridicule where there was only curiosity. The interplay between perception and reality became fascinating and frightening. I understood, with growing clarity, that internalized shame often masquerades as caution, that fear is a teacher in its own right, and that self-knowledge requires confronting both imagination and observation. One of the most challenging lessons came unexpectedly in a group project. I had been paired with classmates who were polite but oblivious to the undercurrents of social negotiation I was navigating. Their casual jokes, their unconscious assumptions, pierced me with subtle discomfort. At first, I reacted with withdrawal, retreating into silence, wishing I could erase the differences that marked me as other. But then I realized I had a choice: to continue hiding, to accept the discomfort silently, or to engage with integrity and clarity. Tentatively, I spoke up, explaining my perspective not as a demand for understanding but as a statement of honesty. The conversation was awkward, not seamless, but it left me with a profound sense of agency. Identity, I realized, is not just about self-perception. It is about navigating the space between self and society, with respect for both. Evenings grew longer as my mind churned with reflection. I started journaling more intentionally, not merely recording events, but analyzing them. I explored moments of discomfort, dissected my responses, traced the origins of fear, and acknowledged the subtle triumphs. I asked myself questions I had never dared before. Why do I fear judgment so intensely? Why does validation matter so much? What assumptions about masculinity and femininity have I internalized without questioning? And, crucially, how do these assumptions affect my interactions, my empathy, my moral compass? The act of writing became a kind of meditation, a methodical way to confront the dissonance between who I had been and who I might become. Physical transformation, while secondary, continued to influence my inner life. I became attuned to the rhythms of my body, the way certain postures felt unfamiliar or awkward, the way movements I had once taken for granted now required thought. Each gesture, however small, became a lesson in presence, in awareness, in the subtle negotiation between identity and appearance. I noticed that my discomfort often originated not from the clothes themselves, but from the gaze I imagined in others, from the anxiety of social misalignment. And in moments of quiet, when I moved without thinking, when I allowed myself to inhabit the form fully, there was a curious sense of liberation, a taste of alignment between internal and external self. The moral dimensions of my journey weighed on me more heavily than I expected. I had been confronted with the ethical implications of honesty, responsibility, and empathy. Every choice, what to reveal, what to conceal, how to respond to curiosity or judgment, felt loaded with significance. I realized that my transformation, while deeply personal, had ripple effects. My interactions shaped perceptions, influenced responses, and offered lessons to those around me. The responsibility of self-awareness, of integrity, became tangible. Identity, I began to see, is never solitary. It is always relational, intertwined with the consciousness of others. By the end of the week, exhaustion had become a familiar companion, but so had reflection. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, considering the week's events, interactions, and insights. I understood, with a clarity I hadn't possessed before, that transformation was not merely an experiment in appearance. It was an ethical, emotional, and cognitive exercise. It demanded patience, humility, courage, and honesty. And in that quiet, lingering stillness before sleep, I felt a nascent sense of coherence, a fragile but growing understanding that who I was becoming was not less than or other, but an expansion of who I had always been, an invitation to inhabit myself more fully, empathetically, and authentically. The following weeks felt like walking a tightrope suspended between my inner world and the outside one. Each day offered subtle challenges I hadn't anticipated. School had become a theater of observation, hallways buzzing with the low hum of expectation, conversations layered with assumptions I had no way to control. I noticed how easily people categorized others, how swiftly perception colored interaction. A glance, a whisper, a careless joke, it all carried weight, sometimes invisible, sometimes unmistakable. And yet, in these microcosms of social expectation, I also discovered unexpected kindnesses, moments of genuine curiosity, and glimmers of understanding that reminded me that empathy, however rare, could exist even in the most rigid systems. Home became both refuge and crucible. My mother maintained her calm, steady guidance, but I could sense her attentiveness sharpening. There were nights when she would sit beside me while I wrote, asking questions that penetrated deeper than any external observation. "What are you learning about fear?" she asked one evening. I paused, pen hovering. "That most of it isn't from people," I admitted slowly. "It's from what I imagine they're thinking." She nodded, as if she had expected this answer. "Exactly," she said. "Most of our anxiety is projected. The challenge is learning to inhabit ourselves fully despite it." Those conversations became my lifeline, helping me translate internal turmoil into insight. My friendships evolved in ways I hadn't predicted. Some peers were openly supportive, others were cautious, as if they were testing the boundaries of understanding. One afternoon, I found myself in a conversation that cut deeper than I expected. A friend asked, "Do you ever wish you could just be normal again?" The question hit me in the chest. Normal. The word felt both alien and familiar. I realized that their curiosity was not judgment but a need for comprehension, a reflection of their own assumptions about identity. I took a deep breath and tried to articulate the complexity, that I didn't wish to escape myself, that this journey was uncomfortable but necessary, that growth required confronting discomfort, both internal and external. The conversation ended awkwardly, but I felt a quiet satisfaction. Clarity, I realized, was not about comfort, it was about honesty. The moral weight of my choices became clearer every day. I began to recognize that my actions had consequences beyond my own sense of self. The way I navigated social situations, whether I retreated, explained, or absorbed judgment, affected others' perceptions and, sometimes, their own capacity for empathy. Each decision carried subtle moral implications, a choice to speak honestly, a choice to confront fear, rather than hide, a choice to observe quietly rather than judge. Transformation was no longer merely personal, it was an ethical exercise, an ongoing negotiation between integrity, vulnerability, and relational awareness. I also began to notice the more subtle internal shifts. The clothes I wore, the posture I adopted, the voice I cultivated. All these external markers began to influence my internal life in unexpected ways. I discovered patience I hadn't known I possessed, compassion I hadn't realized I could summon, and a growing capacity for self-reflection that felt almost like a muscle I was learning to flex. Each morning's ritual, choosing an outfit, adjusting posture, rehearsing speech, became an exercise in mindfulness, a way to inhabit my body with intention rather than fear. It was exhausting, yes, but the fatigue was different now. It was not shame or anxiety alone, but a kind of labor that promised growth and understanding. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when I wanted to resist entirely, to throw off the clothes, abandon the experiment, and retreat into familiar, unquestioned patterns. Those impulses were strongest when social friction intensified, whispered remarks in class, glances I misread as judgment, the constant self-monitoring that drained mental energy. But every time I yielded to frustration, I reflected on the lessons my mother had instilled. Discomfort is a teacher, reflection is a path, and integrity is cultivated through endurance. I realized that fleeing from discomfort would deny me both insight and agency. The external world, meanwhile, continued to teach me about the relativity of perception. I became attuned to how people interpreted gestures, tones, and appearances, and how those interpretations could be both illuminating and misleading. One day, a teacher remarked casually on the confidence I was showing, and I was struck by how much of that confidence was performative, a deliberate negotiation of fear and posture. Yet the comment felt genuine, as if my conscious effort had begun to translate into authenticity. I understood that growth is sometimes invisible, sometimes misread, but always cumulative. Family dynamics deepened in complexity. My younger sibling, initially amused and confused by my transformation, began to show subtle signs of awareness, curiosity, hesitation, admiration. I realized that my choices were influencing the perceptions and emotional development of others in ways I hadn't predicted. Even small acts, helping with chores while dressed, participating in family routines, took on new meaning. I understood that identity is relational, that selfhood is both personal and social, and that ethical responsibility extends to those affected by our self-expression. By night, I would collapse into reflection. Journaling became more analytical, more introspective, a dialogue with myself, rather than a record of events. I explored the tension between internal and external identity, the interplay of fear and courage, and the moral stakes of honesty. I questioned why social conformity had such a gravitational pull, why visibility was so threatening, why empathy was so fragile. And through this sustained reflection, I began to cultivate a sense of coherence, however fragile, a recognition that identity is iterative, relational, ethical, and profoundly human. I noticed subtle transformations in my emotional landscape. Moments that had previously triggered panic or shame now prompted curiosity or careful observation. I felt gratitude for challenges, recognition for insight, and a growing compassion for myself and others. Even when interactions were uncomfortable, even when judgment or misunderstanding arose, I began to approach them with awareness, reflection, and intentional response rather than instinctive fear. Transformation, I realized, was as much about how I perceived the world as how the world perceived me. By the end of this period, I had developed a rhythm, a flow, a growing sense of ethical and emotional awareness that framed my daily life. The external markers of transformation, clothing, posture, voice, remained tools, but the real work was internal: attention to feeling, reflection on morality, cultivation of empathy, and acceptance of uncertainty. I was learning to inhabit myself fully, in ways that were uncomfortable, illuminating, and profoundly human. And as I lay in bed at night, exhausted but awake in mind and heart, I realized that this journey was not temporary or performative. It was the beginning of a sustained evolution, one that demanded honesty, courage, and deliberate engagement with both self and society. The weeks that followed brought a subtle shift in intensity. The initial novelty of transformation had faded, replaced by a weightier awareness of responsibility, perception, and consequence. Every day carried the same elements: dressing, navigating interactions, observing reactions. But now each act seemed imbued with layers I had only glimpsed before. I began to notice the way assumptions solidify without notice, how classmates unconsciously categorize, how even my closest friends measure comfort, how family observes in silence and reacts in subtle, careful ways. It was exhausting, in the way that profound self-exploration always is, and it forced me to confront the boundaries of patience, empathy, and integrity. One day at school, I found myself confronted with a situation that crystallized the tension I had been feeling. A group project meeting escalated unexpectedly. A peer made an offhand comment, something about trying too hard to be different, and the words, though casual, hit a nerve I hadn't known I had exposed so widely. My heart raced, my thoughts scattered. I had the option to retreat, to ignore, to pretend the words didn't sting, but something inside me insisted on acknowledgement. I spoke, carefully, explaining not defensively but honestly what I was experiencing. The conversation was tense, awkward, and far from perfect, but in that moment, I realized the power of deliberate honesty. My voice, once shaky and hesitant, carried weight simply because it was rooted in reflection and truth. At home, the dynamic with my mother grew even more nuanced. She no longer offered guidance in obvious ways. Instead, she created space for me to wrestle with my own judgments, fears, and missteps. One night, she asked me to reflect aloud. Where did you feel yourself shrink today? Where did you stand tall? The question stopped me cold. I had spent so much energy negotiating external perception that I hadn't paused to measure internal growth. Speaking honestly, I admitted moments of shrinking, when I feared judgment, when I silenced curiosity, when I felt the weight of assumed failure. I also acknowledged moments of standing tall, when I spoke my truth, when I allowed empathy to guide my actions, when I recognized subtle growth in myself. That exercise, though brief, illuminated the slow but persistent transformation I was undergoing. Peer interactions continued to provide both challenge and insight. I became acutely aware of microdynamics, how body language communicates beyond words, how tone implies intention, how assumptions shape perception. One particularly memorable afternoon involved a casual conversation during lunch. A peer, genuinely curious but tentative, asked, "Do you ever feel trapped in this experiment?" The question, simple as it seemed, reverberated through me.
Trapped.
The word conjured fear, discomfort, and resistance. And yet, as I considered it, I realized I wasn't trapped. I was engaged. I was participating in a deliberate confrontation with identity, perception, and morality. The discomfort, then, was not confinement but a tool, a mechanism for learning and growth. Family observation remained a constant undercurrent. My younger siblings' initial amusement had evolved into tentative acceptance, sometimes curiosity, sometimes caution. Their subtle questions and quiet attentiveness reminded me that my choices had consequences beyond myself. I began to notice patterns, the small ways my presence challenged preconceptions, the silent lessons in empathy and understanding that unfolded simply because I existed differently. Even mundane acts, helping with chores, participating in conversation, navigating disagreements, took on new significance. Identity, I realized, is never solitary. Selfhood exists in conversation with others, and ethical responsibility extends to the people our lives touch, even in ways we might not immediately perceive. I also confronted internal ethical dilemmas that had been simmering beneath the surface. There were moments when I felt compelled to retreat into denial, to rationalize avoidance, to abandon the discomfort entirely. Each time, reflection revealed the cost: denying growth, evading honesty, and weakening empathy. Conversely, moments of intentional engagement, even small ones, yielded insight, moral clarity, and the quiet satisfaction of integrity. I began to understand that transformation is not simply about external markers or identity labels. It is about cultivating the courage to inhabit oneself fully, ethically and empathetically, even when doing so provokes fear, misunderstanding, or resistance. The physical aspects of transformation, posture, voice, attire, continued to influence internal experience in profound ways. I noticed that the smallest adjustments could alter perception and, more importantly, self-perception. Standing a little taller, speaking with deliberation, or choosing garments that reflected my evolving identity created a feedback loop. External alignment reinforced internal coherence. The sensation was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but over weeks, it accumulated into a tangible sense of agency. My body, once a source of uncertainty, became a conduit for reflection, learning, and ethical engagement. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, I experienced a moment of profound introspection. I had encountered misunderstanding from peers, misread signals, and my patience had frayed. Alone in my room, I reflected on the layers of fear, judgment, and expectation I carried, not just about others, but about myself. I realized that much of my suffering arose not from external events, but from internal narratives I had constructed, assumptions about judgment, imagined failure, anticipated shame. The insight was both humbling and liberating. Growth, I saw, required confronting not only society but the self, and often the more daunting challenge was dismantling internalized narratives rather than negotiating external reality. Sleep that night brought a strange sense of reconciliation. Exhausted in body but alert in mind, I recognized the contours of my evolving identity, the tension between internal truth and external expectation, the moral responsibility inherent in self-expression, the ethical labor of empathy, the necessity of honesty, and the fragile but persistent coherence emerging from sustained reflection. Transformation, I realized, was no longer simply experimental. It had become a lived ethic, a daily negotiation, a deliberate practice of self-understanding and moral engagement. By the end of this phase, I could feel the cumulative effect of weeks of conscious living, reflection, and ethical practice. I was no longer simply reacting to circumstances or external expectation. I was engaging with them intentionally, with awareness, with responsibility. I was learning to inhabit myself fully, not perfectly, but ethically and authentically. And as I lay in bed, exhausted yet contemplative, I felt something I had not known before, a profound sense of alignment, not between who I was perceived to be and who I wanted to be, but between my internal conscience, my emotional awareness, and the deliberate way I navigated the world. I remember the morning differently than I do the others, as if the light itself carried a quiet significance I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't the sun, or the absence of it, but the way the air felt, the weight of time pressing gently yet insistently against my consciousness. I woke with the strange sensation that something had shifted overnight, not in the obvious way of clothes or posture, but in the subtle, unspoken alignment between my mind and my body, between perception and understanding. There was no fanfare, no sudden revelation, just a sense of quiet continuity, as though the work I had been doing, the reflection, the moral and emotional labor, had begun to crystallize into a coherent sense of self. I dressed carefully that morning, as I had for weeks, but the act felt different. I no longer thought of it as an experiment or a performance, dictated by my mother's instructions. The clothes were no longer a cage or a test, they were a medium, a vehicle for inhabiting myself intentionally. Each motion, the smoothing of fabric across my shoulders, the adjustment of a skirt, the subtle modulation of my voice, was conscious yet not anxious. There was a sense of rhythm, of continuity between internal thought and external action that I hadn't known before. For the first time, I felt the possibility of coherence, of alignment between who I felt I was and who I presented to the world. The journey to this point had been far from linear. I thought of the early days, the fear, the awkwardness, the self-conscious glances, the imagined judgments that never materialized. I remembered the small, sometimes humiliating moments, tripping over a hem, mispronouncing a word, hesitating in front of a mirror. At the time, those moments had felt like failures, as if they marked the limits of my capacity to inhabit this new space. And yet, in reflection, I realized they were lessons, microcosms of the larger moral and psychological work I had been undertaking. Each misstep had forced me to confront impatience, insecurity, and shame. Each discomfort had demanded reflection, honesty, and empathy. I understood now that growth is often invisible in the moment, accumulating quietly until it manifests as understanding, coherence, and agency. School that day was unremarkable on the surface. Hallways buzzed with familiar chatter, classrooms hummed with a low undertone of conversation. But for me, every interaction carried a subtle resonance. I noticed microexpressions, fleeting glances, and gestures that I once might have misread or dismissed. I realized that I had become attuned not merely to how I was perceived, but to the emotional and ethical dimensions of perception itself. I was beginning to understand the delicate interplay between identity, expectation, and relational ethics, the ways in which honesty, integrity, and empathy shape human interaction in ways both subtle and profound. A moment during lunch crystallized something I had been learning incrementally over weeks. I sat with two friends, both of whom had been supportive yet tentative in their engagement with my transformation. A casual comment sparked an honest conversation. One friend said, "I can see how much effort this takes. You don't have to say anything. I can tell." The recognition hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't praise. It wasn't judgment. It was understanding. They saw the labor behind the appearances, the ethical work behind the gestures, the cognitive and emotional effort embedded in every interaction. And in that recognition, I felt a deep, almost vertiginous affirmation that the process I had endured, the awkwardness, the uncertainty, the internal moral wrestling, was real, tangible, and consequential. Home, as always, remained a crucible for reflection and moral clarity. My mother had shifted her approach subtly, moving from instruction and oversight to quiet observation, punctuated by probing questions that invited self-examination. One evening, as I recounted the day's events, she asked, "What did you learn about integrity today?" I paused, and the question forced me to consider not just what I had done, but how I had approached each interaction, each hesitation, each choice. I realized that integrity is not a single act but a pattern, an accumulation of small decisions, each weighed with awareness, each enacted with care. It is the decision to act honestly even when no one is watching, to confront discomfort rather than avoid it, and to recognize the impact of one's presence on others, however subtle. I began to see patterns emerging in my own thinking. Fear and anxiety often originated not in reality, but in expectation, in assumptions about judgment that were rarely realized. Embarrassment, once pervasive, had lessened, replaced by a reflective awareness that missteps are part of learning, and that self-compassion is as crucial as self-examination. I understood that my early reluctance to inhabit this identity fully was not cowardice, but a natural negotiation of uncertainty and risk, and that the courage I had cultivated was not an innate trait, but the product of sustained, conscious effort. Friendships deepened as a result. I noticed that some friends had begun to engage with me differently, not out of obligation, but because I had invited honesty into interactions that had previously been superficial. Conversations became layered, nuanced, and reflective. I found myself articulating emotions I had once avoided, sharing insights I had discovered through deliberate reflection, and listening with a patience and attentiveness I had rarely exercised before. Empathy, I realized, is a skill honed in context, cultivated through sustained engagement with others' experiences and reinforced by self-awareness. One particularly quiet evening, I reflected on the broader social implications of my journey. I had spent weeks navigating perception, expectation, and moral responsibility, and in doing so, I had gained insight not only into my own identity, but into the subtle workings of society itself. I observed how assumptions about gender and appearance structure interactions, how social norms are enforced both explicitly and implicitly, and how courage, empathy, and integrity can disrupt or negotiate those norms in meaningful ways. I realized that identity is never solely personal. It is relational, ethical, and deeply embedded in the social fabric. The psychological dimension of my transformation became increasingly apparent. I noticed the accumulation of self-awareness, the emergence of patience, the capacity to tolerate discomfort, and the ability to reflect critically on internal narratives. I recognized patterns of thought that had previously constrained me: the fear of judgment, the compulsion to conform, the internalized belief that difference is inherently risky. These patterns did not vanish, but through deliberate observation and ethical practice, they were tempered, contextualized, and integrated into a coherent sense of self. I also recognized the fragility of social perception. One small misstep, a tone of voice, a misunderstood gesture, could trigger assumptions and judgments. And yet, I had learned that the responsibility for ethical engagement is as much internal as external. I could not control perception, but I could control response. I could not dictate understanding, but I could offer honesty. I could not eliminate discomfort, but I could inhabit it fully, reflectively, and empathetically. This awareness became a cornerstone of my identity, a lens through which I understood both myself and the relational world around me. By the end of that day, I had reached a subtle but profound understanding. Transformation is not merely a matter of appearance, behavior, or external validation. It is an ongoing negotiation of identity, ethics, empathy, and self-awareness. It is the practice of inhabiting oneself fully, honestly, and with integrity, even when that practice provokes discomfort, misunderstanding, or resistance. It is the recognition that growth is iterative, relational, and cumulative, and that the real work is internal, the conscious alignment of thought, feeling, and action in the service of authenticity and moral engagement. That night, I lay in bed longer than usual, tracing the contours of my experiences, recalling the cumulative lessons of weeks and months. I considered the early days, the awkwardness, the anxiety, the fear of judgment, and compared them to this moment of quiet clarity. I saw the trajectory not as linear but as a spiral, each circuit layering reflection atop experience, insight atop discomfort, ethical awareness atop emotional labor. I realized that the narrative of my transformation was not about clothing, posture, or even gender expression. It was about inhabiting myself ethically, empathetically, and consciously. I thought of my mother, her steady guidance, her willingness to hold space for my growth without dictating outcomes. I thought of friends, peers, and teachers who had reflected understanding, curiosity, and patience. I thought of the self I had been, the uncertainty, the fear, the resistance, and of the self I had become, a self capable of reflection, ethical reasoning, empathy, and deliberate engagement with both internal and external worlds. And I felt, for the first time fully, that transformation had achieved its purpose. It had illuminated the pathways of identity, moral responsibility, and human understanding in ways that transcended the superficial markers of clothing or appearance. In that quiet, lingering moment, I understood that I was no longer merely performing an identity or experimenting with appearance. I was living ethically, reflecting deeply, engaging empathetically, and inhabiting myself fully. Transformation, I realized, is not an event but a practice, a continuous negotiation of self, society, and conscience. It is the willingness to confront discomfort, to embrace reflection, to act with integrity, and to cultivate understanding for oneself and others. And in that understanding, I found a sense of coherence, not perfect or static, but alive, relational, and profoundly human. The journey had begun with a whispered conversation in a kitchen, an invitation to explore, to reflect, to inhabit an unfamiliar space. It had continued through awkward mornings, difficult conversations, social missteps, internal crises, and cumulative reflection. And now, after weeks of deliberate engagement, I felt something rare and valuable: alignment. Not alignment dictated by expectation or conformity, but alignment cultivated through honesty, empathy, ethical practice, and sustained reflection, a fragile, persistent coherence that allowed me, at last, to inhabit myself fully, consciously, and with integrity. It took months, Maybe years in the sense that personal growth can stretch time beyond the calendar to understand what had truly shifted. Looking back, I see the journey not as a series of dramatic moments, but as a subtle accumulation of choices, reflections, and encounters. Each hesitation, misstep, and triumph had layered into a consciousness that could hold complexity, contradiction, and compassion simultaneously. I had begun as someone grappling with fear and curiosity, resisting change while longing for understanding. I emerged as someone learning to inhabit life deliberately, ethically, and empathetically, recognizing that identity is never fixed and that selfhood is inseparable from relational and moral awareness. The clothes, the voice, the posture, they no longer define me. They were tools, catalysts that revealed truths I might otherwise have avoided. The real transformation was internal. Patience cultivated through discomfort, courage forged in reflection, empathy strengthened by observation. I came to understand that difference is not threat, that vulnerability is not weakness, and that honesty, both with oneself and with others, is the most radical form of integrity. I still catch glimpses of the old uncertainty, and some days are heavier than others. Social pressure, fear of judgment, and the pull of expectation never entirely vanish. But now I approach them differently, with awareness, with reflection, with the ethical and emotional tools I have honed over months of conscious practice. I navigate the world not as someone performing a role or testing an experiment, but as someone inhabiting life fully, observing carefully, and acting with deliberate care. I have also come to see the broader lesson of the experience. Transformation is not simply personal, it radiates outward. The way we inhabit ourselves, even in private, shapes interactions, informs understanding, and teaches others, often silently, how to engage with difference, uncertainty, and complexity. Identity is relational. Morality is lived. Empathy is practiced. The most profound lessons often arrive in the quiet moments, a conversation that feels ordinary, a glance that carries recognition, a reflection that illuminates choice. And so I continue, not with certainty, not with perfection, but with awareness, curiosity, and integrity. I am aware that life will keep presenting challenges, misreadings, and moments of fear. But I am also aware that growth, self-understanding, and moral reflection are available at every turn, waiting for attention, courage, and honesty. I can inhabit myself fully, ethically, and empathetically, and in doing so, I can witness others doing the same. The journey began with a quiet conversation in a kitchen, a directive that felt both strange and terrifying. It ends, not with finality, but with ongoing possibility. The possibility of alignment between thought and action, self and society, identity and morality. And in that alignment, fragile, evolving, profoundly human, I find not just understanding of myself, but understanding of what it means to be fully alive in the world, accountable, reflective, and compassionate.